So, welcome to Creating Safe Spaces. I'm Anne Rolfe of Mentoring Works, and I have a background in adult learning, career counselling, and professional development. I've been in business for 30 years, and my latest book, which will be coming up on your screen in a moment, is Mentoring Mindset Skills and Tools. And I've spoken on this topic in Australia, Canada, China, Singapore, and the Philippines, as well as the USA. These webinars, as I just mentioned to those on the live webinar, are attended from people in all parts of the world. And although I speak mainly from a corporate perspective, I have worked with not-for-profit organisations, educational institutions, universities and so forth, TAFE, government agencies and community groups. So the content is going to be applicable to all of those sorts of areas. Now, this webinar is actually designed not only for mentors. So mentors do want to create that relationship of support so that they can help people find insight, generate ideas, and actually inspire other peoples. But as well as mentors, and you might be in a management role or a team leader role, and managers and leaders need to build safe spaces to have developmental conversations with employees. And there's a growing trend to regular feedback and development rather than those annual performance appraisals with rating scales. We're seeing that in the workplace, it's much more important to have monthly or even weekly or perhaps even daily conversations with those around you that can help them to develop. So I call those mentoring conversations as well. And then we've got educators. Perhaps you're working in a classroom and you want to make that a place where students feel free to ask questions, express different opinions, and listen and critique to what they are offered. Now, and often there are some cultural issues too. I've worked with a lot of mentors and educators in Singapore and in some of the other Asian neighbours we have in our area, and there can be some cultural limitations on people in a classroom where you actually want interaction and you want to stimulate the critical thinking of your students, and yet they might be a little bit shy about doing that. So it's really important to make the classroom a safe space also in that way. And what we have in common, whether we are mentors, managers, or indeed some form of teachers, is that we actually want to we want people to be creative. We want to stimulate their curiosity. In fact, we'd like to create a thirst for knowledge and learning. And most of all, we want to unlock people's potential and help them recognise their talents and develop their capabilities. Now, some of you may have been on a previous webinar I ran. The last webinar I ran was called Mentoring and Safety, and it was based on the acronym. Safety is an acronym, and the neuroscientists Dr. Norman Chorn and Dr. Terry Hunter of the BrainLink group use this acronym safety to spell out social drivers or levers, if you like. These are the social levers that stimulate the threat and reward mechanism in the brain, and the safety acronym. And I have put this in the handout for you, if just in case you didn't attend that last webinar. But the acronym safety is, first of all, the S stands for security, and the need that we have for certainty, predictability, and stability, and the fact that when we do not feel that security, it triggers the defensive mode in the brain, and it's very difficult to have conversations, constructive conversations, with people who are in defend mode in their minds. So the S is for security, certainty, predictability, and stability. The A is for autonomy, and this is our freedom to choose and decide things for ourselves. And again, when we don't feel we've got sufficient autonomy, it can trigger the threat mode, the defend mode in our brain. The F stands for fairness, a need for equity, transparency, and social justice. The E is for esteem, our status in relation to others, the amount of recognition we have and acceptance in a particular group. And then trust, belonging to a group or a tribe, feeling safe in our relationships with others so that we can actually trust the team, the group, the tribe, the people we associate with, or the person with whom we are having a relationship. And then added to this, although all 5 of these social drivers impact on our brains and can trigger the fight flight reaction, which is the defensive reaction, each of us has a personal priority. So the why is your personal priority, your particular dominant driver. Which one of these is more important and more likely to trigger you into that fight flight mode? So I'm not going to go into safety more than just that very brief recap, because the recording of that webinar is actually still on the website and will be just for a day or so more until I replace it with the recording today. So what I want to cover in today's webinar is looking at the fact that it is so surprisingly easy to trigger that defend mode. And there we have the brain and the emotional reaction that is often triggered and triggers the fight flight response. And what we really want to do when we're going to engage people in constructive conversations is to engage the prefrontal cortex and their executive function. That's where we can talk to people. That's where we can have a rational, logical discussion. It's terribly easy to flip the switch into fight flight, and I've actually got some resources online for you to go back into that information if you wish to do so. There's several blog posts, there's several slideshows, and again the URLs, the links are in the worksheet. So it is surprisingly easy for the brain to jump into that defend mode when there are perceived threats or conflict or challenges in the environment. And what tends to happen is that, triggered by the amygdala in the limbic system of the brain, thoughts arise with the fight, flight, freeze reaction. And this is a survival instinct to help us cope with life. But the downside is that this kind of thinking, the defensive thinking, actually forms a bit of a vicious circle. It reinforces our defensiveness. It actually heightens tension and gets in the way of communication and relationship building. The good news is that the opposite is also true. The more we can engage that executive function of the brain, the more we're able to self-regulate. So we want to help others to do that. And I'm guessing that everyone on the line at some stage or another has been on an aircraft. And you know, when you get on the flight, before they even take off, they do that safety demonstration. And the first thing they tell you, or one of the things they tell you there is, they say if there's a lack of oxygen, the oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling. And they tell you very clearly, fit your own mask first before you can help, before you try to help others. So you and I must be able to model non-defensive behaviours and develop the habit of non-defensive thinking if we're going to assist others. And that begins by recognising some of the thinking patterns that can put us into that vicious cycle of defense or a virtuous circle of trust. I've put a table in your worksheet for today, but if you don't have the worksheet, that's okay. You can draw up the table just on a piece of paper. Basically, what we're looking at are some of the typical patterns of thinking that we might observe in ourselves and in other people. And I'm going to work through a set of these defensive patterns and contrast those with what the sort of thinking that when we've engaged the executive function of the brain, that's more constructive, that allows us to have productive conversations. So remember, you can ask a question at any time, make a comment or an observation. Don't wait for me to invite you to do so. Type in at any time. Really interested in your own experiences and your observations as we go through this. And I'll pause about halfway through this table to read and respond and invite further comment. So, looking at some of the patterns, the first one that I want to talk about is the defensive thinking pattern of catastrophizing. This is where we worry about something and escalate it. This is where the saying comes from, we make a mountain out of a molehill. We turn a minor setback into a major catastrophe. We act as if the worst case scenario is inevitable. Now remember, this type of thinking is generated by our fight, flight response. It's generated by emotions. That's emotion, energy to move us. That's a purpose of emotion, in my view, generating energy so that we can move, we can run, we can fight, or we can make some sort of change. We've evolved from survivors. Our ancestors actually had the capacity to think of worst case scenarios so that they could run from them, fight them, or freeze and hide from them, or come up with a strategy to deal with catastrophe. Today, that sometimes serves us, but most of the time it causes unnecessary fear and stress that can prevent us thinking clearly. That eats up our energy and it obstructs communication. The alternative is to put things in perspective. And I'd love to hear from you. Do you catch yourself catastrophizing sometimes? And the emotional reaction is always fast. Our limbic system is designed for survival, so it's hair trigger, nanoseconds, and we respond emotionally. It's a little bit later that the executive function kicks in and catches up. Okay, I'm seeing some comments coming in here. Okay, we've got a participant who says, wow, I tend to catastrophize most of the time. And as I said, sometimes it's useful to catastrophize as long as you then turn that around to a positive approach. You know, I like that saying, plan for the worst. And I'm sorry, plan for the worst, expect the best. So you've got a contingency plan. I'm big on having, plan B, plan C, and plan D if necessary. And my goodness, I had to work on that this morning when we had troubles with the start of the webinar. But it's getting it into perspective. When the executive function of your brain kicks in, it's saying, okay, things like, and you might share also, what sort of things do you say to yourself when you catch yourself catastrophizing, to sort of calm the emotions down and start to get a perspective on what's really going on. And it can be yourself, or you might do this for other people. Let me know if you've said these sorts of things to other people. So you can say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that this will happen? Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that this catastrophe that you foresee will happen? And then on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad would it be if it did? So as I was desperately trying 10 minutes, 15 minutes out from the webinar, and then the minutes are ticking by, and then we're over time, it's 1 minute past 9 and 2 minutes past 9 and 3 and 5 minutes past 9, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, if I can't get this webinar started, how bad is that going to be? I'm going to look stupid. All this commentary is running through my mind while I'm still trying to figure out what is the problem and how do I fix it. And that and that commentary can get in the way of the brain that's trying to figure out what's the problem, how do I solve it. So as soon as I had a little bit of perspective, well, if I can't get this going, I've got everyone's email address. I can email everybody, apologize to them. We've all had technical issues at one stage or another where things have gone wrong. I will apologize and I will reschedule. I will do something to make up for this. It's not a catastrophe. It's unfortunate. It's not life or death here. And some of us react as though it was. And that's because our brains are descended from survivors when it was a life or death. So we've got one participant saying, tend to catastrophize a lot. Okay, Lisa saying, not as much as when I was younger. Yeah, I'm with you, Lisa, on that, because I find the more experience you have where failures happen and it isn't the end of the world, you kind of can reassure yourself a little bit. Okay, and Lisa's saying, yeah, I always have several plans and most of the time I don't have to use them. Yeah, it's the one time you don't have the backup, though, that things go wrong. Okay, and someone's saying, I often say, will someone die if this happens? And if not, then, it's okay. Good. So thank you for sharing those comments. I liked, it was funny, how funny is it that I put that as our first comment and I had an exact example of that this morning. It wasn't too funny while it was happening, but we can laugh now. Okay, so the next one I want to share with you is dichotomous thinking. Okay, and what I mean by that is the kind of either or, black and white thinking. You're either for me or against me. Something is simply, and it's quite simplistic really, good or bad, right or wrong. There are no shades of grey, no nuance, no layers. And you see this triggered on social media, don't you? Someone puts up an opinion and they'll get some agreement and they'll get some blasts. And then you might see someone who does have a more nuanced and layered argument, someone who can actually show some other possibilities. This is the executive brain kicking in. The immediate reaction is kind of the black and white, good, bad, right, wrong. But if we can get over ourselves in terms of I agree or I disagree and get the executive function of our brains going, then we can actually start to see beyond the black and white. We can unpack the issue. We can explore the complexities and have kind of a possibility mindset. So we entertain possibilities rather than shut down in fairly judgmental ways. So the third one then is, and this comes about when we're in that defend mode, when our brain is firing with the fight, flight, or freeze kind of function going on there. And our vision is narrow and shallow, and we see and react to the surface issue. So it's kind of a bit similar to the previous one, but especially in a conflict situation. Whereas the executive function takes us deeper and allows us to look for underlying needs. So what's really going on here? What's the motivation behind this? What do people need? Not just the surface issue. And looking at underlying needs helps us understand different points of view. The executive function is behind active listening. It is stimulating curiosity and respectful inquiry that allows us to negotiate, problem solve, and resolve conflict. So working the problem together, actually taking that problem solving approach, that sort of rational, logical approach, instead of reacting to the initial issues. Okay, once again, in defend mode, particularly when it's constantly reinforced by the sort of defensive thinking, it's us against the world, and we need to be right. We want to prove we are right. We marshal all arguments to defend our position. We may even cherry pick the facts. Have you noticed how politicians tend to do that? Cherry picking facts. and choosing statistics and maybe even taking them out of context to support their own argument. We may deny contrary of evidence and dig our heels in and become more and more convinced of our own rightness. We get entrenched in a particular point of view. It takes a very strong will and or a very practiced executive function in our brain to lose our fear of contradiction. It's only when we feel personally secure that we can let go of the need to be right and be willing to learn, in fact, to change our mind. I'd love you to share your thoughts on this one. I saw an interview with Dr. Brian Cox yesterday morning. He's the scientist out of the UK behind some wonderful television programs we're seeing at the moment where he explores science and nature and patterns and so forth. He's kind of the David Attenborough, younger version of David Attenborough, but he's looking more at science than animals and creatures and that sort of thing. I don't know if you saw that interview, but what he said was it's as much about the process that inspires him to make these television programs. The subject matter, and he was talking this week about snowflakes and how every snowflake is unique and different, even though they have some similarities. And there are some governing rules, some laws, if you like, that actually are the reason behind snowflakes, while being similar, every one of them being unique. And it's the science and the scientific method that he's wanting to get people really turned on to. And he talked about how wonderful it is to be proved wrong, because scientists generate a hypothesis. They set up an experiment to test that hypothesis, and they look for evidence. And if the evidence disproves their hypothesis, they have learned something, they've gained something, and they should be really happy about that. So I'm going to pause for a moment and give you a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far. I've got 3 or 4 more patterns of thinking to share with you, but I'd like some feedback from you, some comments, observations, or questions on the ones we've covered so far. Okay, I'll move on to the next of the thinking patterns then, and this is one that we all get trapped into from time to time. We all do this. We jump to conclusions based on limited information. We mistake opinions for facts. Have you ever seen someone or heard someone who makes a statement as if it were fact, when in fact it's an opinion, it's a belief, and but they are so convinced. And I think we've probably all prejudged information, and it's interesting when we claim something as the truth, when in truth it's a belief. There's nothing wrong with being true to your beliefs or having strongly held opinions. What gets us into trouble is when we insist they are facts or truth. We set up conflict, because if I'm making a statement as if it were a fact, when in fact it's a belief or an opinion, if I claim I'm right, then that makes you, if you have a different opinion or belief, and I'm saying I'm right, it makes you wrong. If my belief is true, yours must be false. And there are 2 very constructive things we can do. One is to recognize and own beliefs, opinions, and assumptions. We can, in fact, use statements like, I believe, I think, in my opinion, or in my experience, what I found to be the case. Because a belief cannot be true or false. It's a belief. An opinion recognizes that there are other points of view. Owning opinions and beliefs allows dialogue, so two-way conversation, so that we don't have to argue. We can simply compare our beliefs or our opinions, knowing that that's what they are. Now, critical thinking is enabled by the executive function, and it interrogates assumptions. So it calls an assumption for what it is, and it sorts facts from opinions and respects beliefs for what they are. Oops. Sorry, I had a bit of a jump around with the slides then. Just going over to see a comment here. Okay, so this comment says, since I am conflict averse, my normal stance is one of reflection and willingness to listen. Once I had someone send me a 3-page email with arguments and literature research which supported his reasons for wanting to do something in a particular way, still not taking into consideration my view. That's dedication to your point of view. That's interesting. And what a positive way to use. So this participant is saying, I am conflict averse. And that's an interesting upside to being conflict averse, the willingness to listen and reflect. But unfortunately, in this case, sounds like it was taken advantage of. And I think that happens quite often as well. Okay, looking to see if there's any more comments just coming in. I'll pause again in a moment. Okay. And I think that example also was an example of the next pattern, defensive pattern of thinking, which is self-justification. Because when we're confronted, defensive thinking springs into self-justification, reasons, excuses, or even denial. And have you noticed how hard it is for people to apologise these days? There have been quite a number of instances recently of media personalities who make sexist or racist comments, who are called out on their offensive remarks, or sports people or other people in the public eye. Sports people can bring the game into disrepute. And quite often people make these, what I call faux apologies, along the lines of, if people were offended, I'm sorry. Instead of the unqualified, I acted thoughtlessly and I apologise. It's a bigger person who can acknowledge offence given and accept, rather than try to make excuses for their mistake. And there was a very good example of this here in Australia this last week. A media personality on a news program, one of the news breakfast programs, used a word that transgender people find offensive, and he didn't realise. He used this word several times and had no idea that this was offensive to a large number of people. Now, there was obviously the usual Twitter storm and so on and so forth. But this man, his name was Karl Stefanovic, and someone on Twitter offered to sit down over coffee with him and educate him. And they did this in a genuine, good intentions way. He took up that offer. In fact, he went beyond that. He gave a wholehearted, quite lengthy, genuine apology. He said that he had no idea. He did say he didn't mean to offend, but he realised that he had. And he started reading and looking and finding out the information, and that this was offensive and why it was offensive. And then he came out with this apology. So I think that was a shining example of how a genuine apology can actually be made. I'm seeing a comment coming in. Gary said, I had a free lunch this week because people both needed to be right about where the uh, where the apostrophe, I think this is, went when describing cheese from a goat. My goodness. Okay, that's amusing. So yeah, okay, thanks, Gary. It can happen all the time. It really is the bigger person who can acknowledge offence given, try not to make excuses, and acknowledge their mistake. So I'm interested in your thoughts as we. Sorry, the slides are being naughty. Okay. So the final point I wanted to make on that table was that defensive thinking is thinking of one's own self-interest. Again, remembering that this thinking springs from our primal survival instinct. It's about what I want. It's about what I need. But as our ancient ancestors discovered, self-interest lets us survive while working together in the family, the tribe, the team for shared outcomes benefits us all and allows us to thrive. So I'm wondering if there's any questions or comments on any of this. And I will make this table available to you on the website when the recording is posted in a couple of days' time. It's a blank table in your handout for you to fill in, but I'll put the filled out one or the slide up on the website for you. Okay. So if we want to reduce defensive interactions, we need to stay in control ourselves. We need to model that non-defensive behaviour. So we need to stay in control. We need our executive function to be in the driver's seat, and we want to reduce stress. We need to lead conversations to constructive outcomes. So whether those are conversations, mentoring conversations where we're helping people to gain insight and inspiration, whether it's as a leader or a manager, maybe setting goals and making plans around developing performance, or whether it's an educator modeling non-defensive behaviour, setting the tone, encouraging, having conversations, drawing students out so they can speak up and speak out and engage in critical thinking as well as creative thinking. If we want to do all that, then we need to notice and understand these defensive patterns of thinking and behaviours that are triggered by those social drivers, the safety acronym. And we can probably recognise the difference in behaviours. So there are three basic types of behaviour. The aggressive defensive behaviour that people engage in, and that equates to the fight aspect of the fight-flight mode, aggressive defensive behaviours. Then there are the passive defensive, and you see these in the workplace all the time where people just avoid contact. They hide behind emails. They won't actually pick up the phone and have a conversation. They won't walk into the office and have a dialogue. They'd rather avoid. It's slamming down the phone. It's walking out. It's the silent treatment or sulking behaviour that we sometimes indulge in our relationships. Now, what we recognise in these two types of behaviour, aggressive defensive, passive defensive, what you can see there is what they have in common, and that is the defensiveness. That's what's generating both those types of behaviour. What we want to do is actually lead people into a safe space where they can be constructive, we can be constructive and have those conversations. So rather than rather than jumping into fight, flight, aggressive or passive defensive behaviours, we actually need to be able to hit the pause button, as it were. As I said earlier, the emotional reaction is very, very fast. It comes first. It takes a little longer for the higher functioning parts of the brain to actually kick in with logic, with rational thinking and the executive function. So we need to be able to pause, take a time out, develop the habit of engaging our executive function. We also need to use our skills intentionally by focusing on positive outcomes. We need to lead these conversations to constructive outcomes, because these patterns of thinking tend to be caught, not taught. So we need to be the models, the role models. We need to be the leaders in these situations. And we can only do that when we work on ourselves, so that we can demonstrate the kind of behaviours we want from other people. So being quite intentional about the way we apply our skills. Just looking to see if there's any questions or comments coming in. Not seeing any. Okay. Assisting people to change from defensive thinking to executive thinking means expanding their comfort zone. So we want to move from that defensive thinking that comes out of the emotional areas of the brain to the executive function. And there's a certain comfort that people feel. Now, the comfort zone originally referred to physical proximity, the distance between two people that feels okay or not. Think about the discomfort you feel when you're sardined into a crowded lift or jammed into public transport at peak hour. Because there's a distance that's comfortable when we're with strangers, when we're talking to strangers. And there's a closer space for intimate friends and family. The actual distance of your comfort zone is cultural, and an even difference here in Australia. It differs between city folk and country folk, and when people shake hands, you'll find that country people tend to lean in but keep their bodies further apart, whereas city people are a little more comfortable probably because they're used to those crowded lifts and public transports. But more generally, the comfort zone is about behaviour. The things we're okay with, we regard as normal and no threat, are within our comfort zone. So you can kind of represent that as if there were a circle there. And inside that comfort zone, there are things we've done before, our automatic responses, and whether they're constructive or not, we each have default patterns of behaviour that are comfortable. And it's not until people are willing and able to step outside of the comfort zone that they actually enter the learning zone. So it takes a bit of courage. And anytime you're asking people to learn, to develop, to change, that's going to be a step outside of the comfort zone. So we need to recognise that learning and development and change of any sort require that step outside of the comfort zone. And it takes courage to move outside the comfort zone. The less safe we feel, the harder it will be. But the more we learn and the more often we are supported, the easier it becomes and the stronger we are. So, as mentors, managers, and educators, we need to create safe spaces to support learning and change. So, I'm going to we're coming into the last few minutes of the webinar. I'm going to pause and take any questions in just a moment, so you can start typing in your questions or comments or observations right now. I just want to give you a heads up. Our webinars, I run webinars most months, usually on the first Friday of the month. or depending on where you are, because people in the US, UK, and other places, it's still Thursday when we're on Friday here in Australia. So our next webinar will be on Thursday the 1st or Friday the 2nd of September, depending on where you are in the world. And if you found this webinar valuable or would like one tailored especially for your own managers or mentors or educators, you can type in the chat box now and I'll get in touch after the webinar, or you can send me an email and we'll set up a time to talk. So, as well as your questions that you might be typing in now, I'd also like to hear from you and suggest that you write down for yourself your key takeaways. What have been the key points for you from this webinar, and how do you think you might use that? So I'm going to hang around and answer any questions. If you'd like to share your key takeaways, I'll if you type them in, I'll read them out. Any actions also, and I'll do that anonymously. So just checking at what's coming in now. Okay, Lisa had to leave for another meeting. Okay, and the recording will be available to you in a few days on the website. It will replace the previous one in just a few days' time. Okay, so key learning from okay, so Gary's takeaway is learning takes place outside the comfort zone and it takes strength to get there. Yeah, it sure does. And I think sometimes we forget that. And really learning can be quite challenging, even when there's very many benefits to the learning and development. It's still going to take that courage to move away from what is our habitual pattern of behaviour or something we've been doing for a very long time. Thanks, Gary. Any other questions or key takeaways or actions to share? Okay, I'm going to stick around, but I will stop the recording now and look forward to speaking with you on the next live webinar. And thank you for being a part of this and listening to, if you're on the recording. I hope you can join us live sometime soon.